Good afternoon, Your Honors. This is case IT 0369T, the prosecutor versus Jovica Stanišić and Franco Simatović.
Thank you, Madam Registrar. As a preliminary matter, I'd like to put a few informal communications on the record before we start with the final argument, closing argument. First, on the 17th of December of last year, the prosecution requested an extension until the 8th of February 2013 to file the consolidated list of protective measures, which was ordered on the 7th of November 2012. That extension was granted on the 18th of December. On the 25th of January of this year, the Chamber notified the parties through another informal communication that this deadline, as well as the deadline to file public redacted versions of confidential exhibits, was further moved to the 8th of March. Second, on the 7th of December of last year, the Chamber staff informed the parties that all references to document 1D1572.1 in its 5th of November 2012 decision on miscellaneous rebuttal documents should be understood as a reference to 1D1572. Third, on the 11th of January of 2013, the prosecution filed a request for guidance in relation to redacting the final trial briefs. On the 17th of January of this year, the Chamber declined to give guidance, expressing its confidence that the parties are able to continue implementing the Chamber's protective measures orders without further guidance. Then, we are here today to hear the closing arguments, at least the beginning of it. Times allotted was 4 hours for the prosecution, 2.5 hours for each defense team, and in the second round, 1 hour for the prosecution and 1 hour for the defense teams together. Mr. Koum, are you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Then you may proceed.
Your Honor, as a preliminary matter, in the interest of remaining in public session as much as possible, earlier today the prosecution filed a confidential filing with references to evidence, and I believe courtesy copies have been handed out to everyone here in the court. Secondly, Your Honor, we will be using a series of slides, and it is also possible if the Chamber wants to adjust its monitors, it will be able to view those slides for a longer period of time. They will be visible on the public projection of these proceedings. With that, Your Honors, I'll begin. Your Honors, when the prosecution opened its case on the 9th of June 2009, I told you that this case, in its simplest terms, is an examination of the conduct of two of the people with primary responsibility for organizing, training, funding, equipping, and directing members of the special units of the Serbian DB to perpetrate grievous crimes in the name of protecting Serbs and securing for them a land free from Croats and Muslims. To establish that proposition beyond reasonable doubt, the prosecution relied on the evidence of 97 witnesses, many the victims of terrible crimes, many former members of the special units of the Serbian D. Others were Serbs who lived where crimes occurred and came forward to provide evidence about the destruction of their mixed ethnic communities. The prosecution tendered videos and intercepted communications by both accused and thousands of pages of documents that give insight into the daily workings of the State Security Service. A large corpus of evidence which, when examined, brings to the light of day the covert criminal operations by the Serbian State Security Service in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Your Honors, the evidence establishing the crimes alleged in the indictment is set out in detail in the prosecution final trial brief. For those members of the public interested in learning more about this evidence, a public version of that brief will be filed in the coming days. It is not our intention today to focus on the detail of the crimes. The fact that they occurred, or even how they transpired, is beyond any reasonable dispute. And in fact, in several instances, the accused acknowledge some of the crimes in their briefs. Rather, we will focus our remarks today on how we have established the accused's participation in and contribution to these crimes, and how that demonstrates their responsibility for them. We will depart from the structure we employed in the brief and try to assist the Chamber now by organizing our remarks according to a different structure. To discuss the case from the perspective of each of the special units of the Serbian State Security Service and the crimes they participated in. Our remarks are not meant to be as comprehensive as the brief, but to usefully amplify certain aspects of it. Later this afternoon, Mr. Adam Weber will provide an overview of the special units of the Serbian State Security Service and address the crimes in which the Red Berets, or quote, the unit, unquote, participated. Crimes in the Krajina, in places like Glina, when on the 26th of July, 1991, 50 of the unit's first members attacked that town and neighboring Struga, targeting the homes, schools, and churches of its non-Serb civilian population, driving them from their homes and farms. On the 5th of August, 1991, Mr. Simatović himself would participate in the attack on Lovinac, attacking with mortars from one side and an armored train from the other. Later that month, on the 26th, Martic delivered an ultimatum to Kievo, telling non-Serbs that coexistence was no longer possible. Martic's police ravaged the town, ransacking and burning the homes of non-Serbs. In October 91, Martic's police and others rounded up 53 unarmed elderly and infirm people in a local firehouse. Their names had already been placed on a list there. The following day, they were slaughtered in Krčanje. The project of cleansing the Krajina of non-Serbs would continue in Vukovici, Saborsko, Skabrnja, and Nadin, with murders and forced removals in November of 1991. After Mr. Weber describes the unit's role in these events, he will trace their movements, or the movements of the unit, into Bosnia and Herzegovina, where in Bosanski Shamac and Doboj, they used their newly honed skills on non-Serbs there with even greater efficiency. Mr. Simatović himself would order the Red Berets into Bosanski Shamac, one unit member proudly asserted that the operation to take control of the town took little more than half an hour. After that, the more time-consuming task of identifying and removing the non-Serb population took place. The Red Berets under the command of Raje Božović worked with local forces to conduct a vicious campaign of ethnic cleansing in Doboj. Non-Serb prisoners were kept in deplorable conditions, like in Sprecha and Perchin's disco, places where they were detained and tortured, all the while, just outside their window, the Red Berets drilled and trained. For some, their torture would only end on the 12th of July, when they met their death on a minefield at the edge of town. However, these were not the first crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina the accused are responsible for. Their first move into Bosnia was in Bijeljina and Zvornik, along the border with Serbia. These crimes, perpetrated by Arkan and his Serbian Volunteer Guard, or SDG, more popularly known from his television ads as Arkan's Tigers, will be the focus of Ms. Rahel Friedman's submissions today. In 1996, while running for public office, Željko Ražnatović Arkan made the statement that we can now see on slide 5. In both Bijeljina and Zvornik, he gave ultimatums. He would destroy the towns if they were not surrendered to him. Arkan.
Mr. Groom, sorry to interrupt you, but what I see on my screen, always the left part is missing, so I can't read the beginning of, but that may be my problem rather than anyone else's problem. You have the same problem? Then we'll try to work on it, but apparently some are missing the left margins, some are not. Please proceed meanwhile, please proceed meanwhile, and we'll see whether we can find a solution for it.
And Your Honors, we will be filing with the registrar a copy of these slides, and I apologize for any inconvenience at the moment. Hopefully it will be sorted soon. Your Honors, here on slide 5, we can see the iconic image that first introduced the world to Arkan's Tigers. Over the course of this trial, one defense witness would put a name to the man kicking the woman who has just been murdered. Shurdan Golubovic, also known as Max. The first place Stanišić deployed Arkan's men was to eastern Slavonia, Vranja, and western Srem, where they were among the most brutal perpetrators of crimes. After Bijeljina, Arkan would move south to Zvornik in coordination with Simatović and the Bosnian Serb leadership. When he arrived, it was clear to the non-Serb population that their lives were under serious threat. Arkan's Tigers would be responsible for many of the killings in Zvornik. Others were committed by paramilitary groups who were given impunity to destroy the non-Serb population of the municipality. Sešel's men were among these paramilitaries, and as Sešel has publicly stated, it was a well-organized operation, organized with the direct involvement of Mr. Simatović. We will then ask you to turn your attention to the crimes of the Scorpions and conclude with Arkan's crimes in Sanski Most in 1995. Ms. Grace Harbor will address you on these points. The Chamber is by now very familiar with the killing of 6 men and boys in Turnovo. taken captive during the fall of Srebrenica, and brought to Trnavo to be murdered. We will amplify our written submissions on this, as well as respond to some of the arguments presented in the defense briefs. The last crimes charged in the indictment concern Arkan's crimes in Sanský Most in 1995. On the 20th of September 1995, the SDG forced approximately 13 detainees into a truck, drove them to the village of Trnava, unloaded them in pairs, and shot them as they stumbled into an abandoned garage. The next day, the SDG crowded more than 65 Bosniaks into small buses, drove them to a place called Sasina, and murdered them in cold blood, slitting the throats of some and shooting others. Your Honors, before we lead you through the evidence setting out the contribution of each accused to these crimes, it will be helpful to spend some measure of time setting out the joint criminal enterprise underlying these crimes. And for this, I would now turn the podium over to Mr. Travis Farr.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. As Mr. Groom has indicated, I'll be addressing the Chamber on matters related to the joint criminal enterprise, and I have 6 points to address. First, I'll discuss the close relationship between the accused. Second, I'll discuss the evidence that Stanišić was an astoundingly well-informed and engaged leader. Next, I'll discuss a DB document signed by Mr. Simatović that corroborates the prosecution evidence regarding events in the Krajina. From there, I'll move on to the accused's involvement in the common criminal plan in early 1991, including the attack on Lovinac. Then I'll briefly discuss the cooperative relationship between public security and state security. And finally, I will discuss the irrelevance of the tensions among Milošević, Karadzic, and Krajčík to the accused's liability for the 1995 crimes. Moving now to my first point about the relationship between the two accused. Each of the accused has sought to distance himself from the other in his final brief, but Your Honor should not be taken in by these arguments. The relationship between the accused was a close relationship of cooperation and trust throughout the indictment period. It is the most important relationship among JCE members in this case. Mr. Stanišić and Mr. Simatović stood side by side at key moments throughout the indictment period. In P390, which we see here on slide number 10, we see them together with Karadzic and Krajčík. And General Milovanović testified that this photo appears to have been taken in Serbia sometime during the war. We also see a still image from P1592, in which Stanišić and Simatović are together in Bajina Bašta in the critical period following the ABIH attack on Skelani. On slide number 11, in a still from P61, we see Stanišić and Simatović celebrating the success of their unit together with Milošević. We also see a still from P3043, in which the accused are together at the hostage release press conference in Bosnia. I'll also mention P391, which we'll see during Mr. Weber's presentation. In that photo, we'll see Mr. Stanišić and Mr. Simatović together again, this time with Karadzic, Krajšnik, Martic, and Stojan Župljanin. Your Honors, I've started with these photos and video stills because they are incontestable evidence that Your Honors can see with your own eyes. But there is also a tremendous amount of witness evidence on the relationship between Stanišić and Simatović. I don't have time to summarize all of it, but I'd like to make one point. At least 4 witnesses describe Simatović as Stanisić's second in command. Babić calls Simatović Stanisić's assistant, and Slišković puts Mr. Simatović directly below Mr. Stanišić in the JATD chain of command. Two other witnesses give similar evidence that is set out at rows A1 to A4 of the confidential evidence chart. The evidence of these 4 independent witnesses is consistent not just with each other, but also with the photos and video stills I've just shown you. The only reasonable inference available to Your Honors is that the relationship between the accused was characterized by a high degree of closeness and trust. And before I move to my next point, I'd also just point out to the chamber that in the pictures we just looked at, Simatović was almost always wearing a camouflage uniform, and he was always in the company of other JCE members. This obviously contradicts his arguments that he only did operative work and was a lowly functionary. My next point concerns Mr. Stanisić's leadership and management style. Stanišić defense witness Čorbić.
Kao, jel ga još bole leđa? Kao, žalio nam se da su ga bole leđa. Vidite u kurac.
I was on the live channel, so I couldn't. Do you have English now again on channel 4?
Yes, Your Honor.
Then we can continue.
Stanišić defense witness Čorbić testified that Mr. Stanišić was a well-informed, active, and involved leader who carefully reviewed information provided to him by subordinates, and who informed himself of the work of individuals several levels below him in the hierarchy. He was not content to rely solely on reporting, but he also traveled to the field to gather information for himself. That's at transcript pages 14423 to 14426. But in fact, it follows from the entirety of Mr. Čorbić's testimony. Mr. Čorbić limited his comments to the context in which he worked with Mr. Stanišić. But General Milovanović's evidence demonstrates that these were general leadership and management traits that Stanišić applied to all of his work, something that we can see here in slide number 14. In video exhibit P376, Milovanović said the following, quote, "I was astounded by Stanisić's knowledge about our situation in Podrinje. Some things he knew even better than I did. He knew who was fighting in which village, who was in command. I really was a bit amazed," unquote. In court before Your Honors, General Milovanović confirmed that he was, quote, "quite amazed with the extent of Stanisić's knowledge and information about particular areas in Bosnia, unquote. That's at transcript page 4385. The picture that these two witnesses, Čorbić and Milovanović, paint of Stanišić's active, involved leadership and detailed knowledge of events in the field corroborates prosecution witnesses heard throughout the case. And one particular point that I would like to emphasize. Given that Stanišić was better informed about some aspects of VRS operations in eastern Bosnia than General Milovanović, a senior VRS officer, was, Your Honors can have no doubt that Stanišić was intimately familiar with all aspects of the operation of his own organization. In that context, I would like to turn to P3251, a document that was obtained and uploaded by the Stanišić defense. The prosecution was not aware of this document until it was disclosed on e-court. This document provides powerful corroboration for the prosecution witnesses who testified about events in the Krajina. The document which you see on slide 16 before you is an official note regarding contact with Daniel Snedden, who, as your honors are aware, was also known as Captain Dragan. It is dated 13 April 1991, and it is signed by operative Franco Simatović. And I note in passing that the signature on this document appears consistent with the signatures on P3039, several of which were identified by Krasmanović as the signatures of Simatović. The first sentence of this document is the most important, and it reads as follows. Quote, on 13 April 1991, a meeting was held with Daniel Snedden in order to discuss the possibilities of his further engagement pursuant to the plan which was presented to him during the last meeting, unquote. This document thus speaks of at least two meetings between Daniel Snedden and the DB, at least one of which was with Simatović. It also explicitly states that the DB is considering further, and I emphasize further, engaging Captain Dragan. The Simatović defense devote 19 pages, more than 60 paragraphs, of their brief to analyzing the DB monitoring of Captain Dragan. But they fail to mention this document even once. At paragraph 295, they come to the conclusion that, quote, the foregoing evidence shows clearly and beyond doubt that Daniel Snedden, aka Captain Dragan, had no contacts or connections with the Serbian DB, unquote. Your Honors, this single document undermines that conclusion and the analysis it relies on. It does more than that, though. It also strongly corroborates the account Captain Dragan gives in Exhibit P2976 of his contacts with Simatović before his deployment to Knin. More generally, it corroborates Captain Dragan's entire account of his cooperation with the DB. Let's listen to what Captain Dragan says about the meeting Simatović described in P3251.
Dakle, njih, kroz taj razgovor, oni su me pitali kako, šta ja hoću da radim, ja sam im rekao šta hoću da radim. Pitali su me kako to planiram da radim, ja sam im sve to ispričao. Onda su me pitali da li bi ja to mogao da napišem, naravno, jer sam sve sam napisao. Jedan kratak kurs od 21 dan. I tad sam u neku ruku sam sprijateljio sa Fenkom. To je išlo mnogo dalje nego taj službeni razgovor.
Your Honors, there was no translation during the playing of that clip. I believe that the transcript was provided to the booth on a copy of slide 17, which is what we're looking at now.
Now, is the language which is seen under the photograph and the video, is that the language of what was said by Captain Dragan?
It is, Your Honor, and it's a complete transcript of what was said.
Yes, under those circumstances, does any of the parties insist to have it replayed, or can we continue? We'll then continue. Mr. Farr, you may proceed.
P3251 provides strong corroboration for Captain Dragan's account. But it does more than that. It also corroborates all the other testimonial and documentary evidence that Your Honors have seen and heard through this case, clearly establishing the relationship between the DB and Captain Dragan. To use just one simple example, the warm embraces between the accused and Captain Dragan at the end of the Kula video make no sense whatsoever in the context of the defense narrative. But they are the most natural thing in the world in light of the prosecution evidence regarding the close relationship between the accused and Captain Dragan. The defense have aggressively challenged the credibility of prosecution witnesses who say that Captain Dragan was engaged by the accused and that he was close to them. These witnesses are, of course, well corroborated by each other and by a large body of other evidence. But this one document, signed by Simatović, and this one video, P61, show on their own that the prosecution witnesses spoke the truth. In short, Your Honors, in light of the strong corroboration among all of the evidence, the Chamber can have no reasonable doubt that the accused sent Captain Dragan to the Kraina and that they cooperated with him while he was there. P3251, Simatović's note about his meeting with Dragan, also refutes another argument that the defense have made with respect to several key individuals in this case. Namely, that the DB could not possibly be cooperating with anyone that it was also monitoring. They have attempted this argument, excuse me, they have attempted this argument with at least three individuals: Captain Dragan, Arkan, and Slobodan Milković, aka Lugar. This argument is unpersuasive even in theory, since there is nothing that would prevent the DB from working with someone they were monitoring, and nothing that would prevent them from monitoring someone they were working with. But the example of Captain Dragan takes this argument from weak to entirely untenable. Given the clear evidence that the DB was indeed cooperating with Captain Dragan even as it monitored him, the Chamber can draw no inferences from the evidence that the DB monitored Arkan and Lugar as well. I would now like to move to my next point regarding the existence of the common criminal plan. The Simatović defense argues that we have failed to prove the existence of a common criminal plan, design, or purpose at all, while the Stanišić defense asserts that we have failed to establish the existence of a common criminal plan prior to September 1991. With respect to the Simatović claim that the JCE never existed at all, I refer your honors to our submissions at the 98 bis stage, which were made in response to an identical challenge by the Simatović defense at that point in time. Regarding the Stanišić defense claim that no criminal plan existed before September 1991, I will turn once again to Captain Dragan. The document on slide 20 before you is a defense exhibit, a report from the second administration of the Belgrade DB Center. It is dated 3 April 1991, just 10 days before Simatović's report recording his meeting with Captain Dragan. This report shows that the DB knew that Captain Dragan was potentially dangerous. It states that Snedden is inclined to terrorism, that he wished to procure a large quantity of weapons, and most importantly, that he had undertaken actions to create and arm paramilitary formations in the Knin Krajina, as you see on the slide before you. In other words, the accused knew at the time they brought him to the Krajina that Captain Dragan was an aggressive and dangerous individual. This shows that the Golubic camp was not a defensive project, as the Stanišić defense has claimed. It also shows that even in April 1991, the accused intended to further the common criminal plan. The attack on the Croat village of Lovinac provides further evidence that the accused intended to further the common criminal plan in the summer of 1991. A witness described the purpose of the attack on Lovinac this way. Quote, "The target was to cleanse the village and to get the entire population out and to establish a purely Serb territory," unquote. And your honors have that citation on slide 21 before you now. This is precisely a statement of the common criminal plan to forcibly and permanently remove non-Serbs. Babić also confirmed that the civilian population was a target of this attack. He said that the attack was directed against the village itself, as well as against the police station, and that Simatović bragged that the whole village had been destroyed. That's P1877 at page 44. At rows A5 to A9 of the confidential evidence table, your honors will find more evidence that this was an attack aimed at forcible displacement. Your honors, as discussed at paragraphs 402 to 405 of our final brief, Mr. Simatović personally participated in the attack on Lovinac, together with Milan Martic. As you see on the slide before you, Babić said, quote, "Frankie, or Franjo Simatović, and Milan Martic with mortars, with a mortar unit. They were the first to open fire on the village of Lovinac, and thus expel the Croats from the Gračac area," unquote. Another witness also corroborates Simatović's participation in the attack, as set out at rows A10 and A11 of the confidential evidence table. And both of these witnesses are corroborated by a key document that we will now look at. A distinctive feature of the attack on Lovinac was its use of an armored train, as set out in the confidential evidence table at rows A12 to A16. On slide number 22, we see a document that links Mr. Simatović to this train, and both Simatović and the train to the attack on Lovinac. This document, which is signed by Mr. Simatović, concerns the creation of an armored train that would, quote, have the capability to target and attack Lovinac, unquote. And the document is dated 21 June 1991. And I would draw the Chamber's attention to the initials at the bottom of the slide before we move on.
The reference to confidential evidence chart row, do we have to? Is there a row number known? Or apparently you want to.
Sorry, I was drawing Your Honor's attention to the initials at the bottom of the slide, slide number 22.
I followed that, and then I put this question, the blue language, see confidential evidence chart row, ...
Yes, Your Honor. You're correct. That it's A5.
A5, thank you.
Apologies. If we move on now to slide number 23. On this slide, Your Honors see the initials we have just looked at from P2673, the armored train document, as well as initials from exhibits D1117, P2420, and P352. The initials on those three exhibits were identified as the initials of Mr. Simatović by defense witness Radovoje Micic, and the initials on all four documents appear to be consistent. Your Honors, this document, together with the consistent witness evidence regarding this attack, shows beyond reasonable doubt that the attack happened, that Simatović participated in it, and that its purpose was to drive out the Croat civilian population. In other words, that its purpose was to further the common criminal plan. The attack also shows that the purpose of the Golubic training camp was not defensive, as the Stanišić defense have claimed. Row A15 of the confidential evidence table establishes that the crew of the armored train was trained at Golubic. Their use in this attack shows that the purpose of training at Golubic was fundamentally linked to the common criminal plan. The attack on Ljubovo also shows that Golubic was not a defensive project. Like the attack on Lovinac, JF39 said that the purpose of the attack on Ljubovo was to, quote, cleanse the village and to get the entire population out and to establish a purely Serb territory, unquote. As established in rows A17 to A19 of the confidential evidence table, the Ljubovo attack was carried out by men trained at Golubic. And this wasn't some kind of a rogue action on their part. It was a kind of graduation exercise from their Golubic training. In other words, this attack, which furthered the common plan, was an inherent part of the training at Golubic. The Golubic camp was intended to further the common criminal plan, and so was the training conducted there. Your Honors, we've seen that Stanišić and Simatović had a close relationship, and that Stanišić was an astoundingly, to use General Milovanović's word, well-informed leader. Based on that, Your Honors can be satisfied that Stanišić knew that Simatović and Martic were in the process of implementing the common criminal plan in the Krajina, and that he supported it. Your Honors can also rely on Stanisić's own actions to find that he shared the common criminal plan from the time he made his contributions in the Krajina and the SPWS. A key event in this regard is Stanišić's traveling to Dal in mid-September 1991 to personally intervene in the conduct of the operations to take Vukovar. Your honors can find further details of this event at rows A20 to A21 of the confidential evidence table. The attack on Dal, including the expulsion of the Croat population, occurred on 1 August 1991 and had been planned by Hadžić and others for at least several days prior to that. And I refer your honors to row A22 of the confidential evidence chart in that regard. This alone proves that the common criminal plan existed prior to September 1991. The intensity of Stanišić's determination in mid-September 1991 that the common goal be achieved as soon as possible supports an inference that he must have shared the goal for some time. So does the fact that he was able to demand, on very short notice, a meeting with high-level leaders regarding military operations. He certainly wouldn't have been able to do that unless he had been involved in planning for some time. Your honors can also properly consider evidence of later events to determine what Stanišić's intent was at the time he provided his contributions in the SAO Krajina and SPWS in 1991. P690 records Stanišić talking with Karadzic about exterminating Croats in January 1992. P61 shows that in 1997, Stanišić gave Goran Opačić an award and praised him in front of the rest of the DB Special Unit. P12 and P990 show that Stanišić celebrated Krajina Security Services Day with Martić, Babić, and Hadžić. And P2667 shows that he congratulated the Krajina security forces on their work going back to 1991. When viewed in light of the extensive evidence of Stanišić's presence in the Krajina, his meetings with Martić, and his assistance in setting up the Krajina security forces, all of this shows that Martić and the other members of the Krajina security services used Stanišić's assistance in precisely the way he intended that it be used. I would now like to deal quickly with the relationship between public security and state security within the Serbian MUP. The defense make much of this distinction, primarily as an attempt to avoid responsibility for things done by Radovan Stojičić, aka Baja. But the evidence of Stanišić's own witnesses shows that this is nonsense. When asked whether Baja had a productive and cooperative relationship with Stanišić and the Serbian DB, defense witness Vlado Dragicevic said, quote, "Both sections of the Ministry of the Interior, i.e., the public security and the state security services, had a very correct cooperation," unquote. And that's at transcript page 14872. Defense witness Nebojša Bogunović also gave an example of cooperation between Jovica Stanišić and a public security special unit. That evidence is addressed at rows A23 and A24 of the confidential evidence table. And your honors will of course recall General Milovanović's evidence about this relationship. He testified that when he asked Baja who Stanišić was, Baja's answer was, quote, "I arrived here with the boss," unquote. That's at transcript page 4385. At the very least, the evidence shows that Baja and the accused cooperated, as did public security and state security more generally. And there is nothing surprising about this. There is nothing surprising about two parts of a single ministry cooperating with each other. It is to be expected that they would in the normal course of things. This has arisen as an issue in this case only because the accused seek to distance themselves from their public security colleagues by drawing artificial institutional boundaries that in reality constituted no barrier whatsoever to cooperation. Your Honors, my next point concerns the defense arguments regarding the tensions among the political leadership of Serbia and the RS, set out at pages 300 to 314 of the Stanišić brief. The defense used this to attempt to defeat liability for the 1995 crimes. In essence, the defense have provided, Your Honors, with evidence of tension in the relationship among just three men: Milosevic, Karadzic, and Krajisnik. They then ask Your Honors to conclude, based on this evidence, that there must have also been a rift in the relationship between the accused and the entirety of the Bosnian Serb leadership as well. This piggybacking argument is an obvious non sequitur, and it is also contrary to the defense's own evidence. Sir Ivor Roberts, the primary witness that the defense depend upon to make this argument, made it clear that the tension was among the political leaders and did not include state security. He said, quote, "That was the impression one had for the reasons I was saying earlier, that while the political leaderships were very much out of sympathy with each other, at other levels, conversations and understandings continued between state security people and the armies," unquote. That's at transcript page 18579. In light of Roberts' testimony, the most that the defense's evidence might show is that Milosevic, Karadzic, and Krajisnik were no longer effectively cooperating. It tells Your Honors nothing about the accused. In fact, however, the defense's evidence does not even support a conclusion that Karadzic, Krajisnik, and Milosevic no longer shared a common criminal goal. A closer look at the dispute among these men shows that their disagreement was only about the degree to which the common criminal plan could be achieved, and not about the common criminal plan itself. The defense say that when Milosevic went to Pale to support the Vance Owen plan, and was subsequently humiliated when it was rejected by the Bosnian Serb parliament, these events led to, quote, "a distinct cooling between the governments," unquote. But Exhibit P2532 shows that in December 1993, 6 months after this supposed cooling, Milosevic, Karadzic, and Krajisnik were still able to sit down together to discuss progress toward the achievement of the common criminal plan and to plan military operations. It bears mentioning, of course, that this meeting was hosted by Jovica Stanišić at the DB headquarters. This meeting makes it crystal clear that the disagreement over the peace plan did not represent a rejection of the common criminal plan by any of the members of the JCE. Milosevic's own comments at Pale show the same thing. In his remarks there, he emphasized that the goal was to consolidate what had already been achieved. He praised the Vance Owen plan in explicitly nationalistic terms. he encouraged support for it because it offered the Serbs 50% more territory than the Muslims, even though their population was 50% less. I refer your honors to P3116 at pages 2 and 3. Exhibit P3047 and page 36 of Exhibit P2358 also showed that Milosevic's support for the contact group plan and the Dayton plan later was also based on nationalistic considerations. In fact, he sometimes phrased his support for the peace plans in terms of the 6 strategic goals of the Bosnian Serbs. The basic questions your honors have to assess in determining liability for the 1995 crimes is whether the common criminal plan still existed. The defense urge you to conclude that the project of ethnic cleansing had finished by 1993 and that the common criminal plan had therefore ceased. But the events at Srebrenica and Žepa in July 1995 are tragic and incontestable proof that ethnic cleansing had not ended in Bosnia and Herzegovina by the middle of 1993. The murders in Trnovo were an inherent part of that ethnic cleansing. I refer your honors to row A25 of the confidential evidence table in connection with Srebrenica and Žepa. Similarly, the charged crimes in Sanski Most show that the process of forcibly and permanently removing non-Serbs, sometimes by killing them, continued there as well. In short, the common criminal plan continued until the last days of the war. The accused's role in the 1995 crimes, which will be discussed by my colleagues, demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that the accused continued to share this plan. With the Chamber's leave, Mr. Weber will now continue the prosecution's submissions.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. As Mr. Groom indicated, I will provide an overview of the special units of the Serbian DB and address the Chamber on matters related to the activities of one of these units, the Red Berets. As part of this discussion, I will address the existence and continuity of the unit between 1991 and 1996, in addition to particular activities of the unit in the Krajina, Bosanski Shamac, and Doboj. The special units of the Serbian DB were paramilitary formations deployed by the accused throughout Croatia and Bosnia. Whether it was the Red Berets applying the Doboj experience, the Tigers enforcing Arkan's policy of taking no prisoners in Dal, or the members of the Scorpions executing 6 Muslim men and boys at Trnovo. The use of these units furthered a common purpose and resulted in mass devastation to the non-Serb population of the former Yugoslavia. These units acted with impunity, with the blessing and support of the State Security Service of Serbia. The evidence in this case has shown that the Red Berets, Tigers, and Scorpions shared many things in common. The special units shared a common symbol of an upward-pointed sword. Their actions were directed by the accused and their subordinates. They operated from nearby bases in Croatia along the border with Serbia in Ilok, Erdut, and Jelitovci. And they participated together in joint operations in both Croatia and Bosnia. Despite their efforts to act in secrecy, despite the attempts of the accused to recycle these efforts to conceal their liability, The evidence consistently demonstrates that Ivica Stanišić and Franko Simatović contributed these special units in furtherance of the JCE's common criminal purpose. The special units of the Serbian DB often operated in coordination with other Serb forces, including the armies, police, and local territorial defense units of Republika Srpska and the Republic of the Serbian Krajina. During these operations, the Serbian DB units were included in joint formations, often referred to as tactical or operational groups. These groups were formed for a specific purpose in a limited period of time. The important thing to remember about this is that any resubordinations were temporary and for a particular purpose. This didn't change the fundamental character of the units as DB units, loyal to the accused. The fact that the accused willingly and repeatedly gave their men to other JCE members just shows that they were cooperating with those other JCE members and contributing to the overall JCE. Examples of this include the participation of the Red Berets in TG-17 during the takeover of Bosanski Shamac, and their participation in TG Ozren during the takeover of Doughboy. Another example is the participation of the Red Berets, Tigers, and Scorpions in tactical groups 2 and 3 during Operation Pauk, or Spider. In their final trial briefs, the accused seek to mitigate their responsibility for contributing DB special units to joint operations with other Serb forces. An example, the defense submissions on the participation of Vaso Mijović and the Red Berets during the 1993 Drina Valley operations. As seen on the slide before the chamber, the Simatović defense asserts that Mijović was within the composition of the VRS. The Stanišić defense acknowledges Mijović had some association with Simatović and claims he had allegiances to many entities. These submissions attempt to obfuscate the fact that the Red Berets trained locals from Bratunac and then participated in combat formations with VRS units at the time. The prosecution would refer the chamber to paragraphs 263 through 269 of its brief concerning the involvement of the Red Berets in Bratunac. As the evidence has shown, these coordinated joint operations with other military or MOOP structures are important because they reflect the accused's intended participation and contribution of special units to other JCE members. It does not make the special units of the Serbian DB formally part of these other structures or diminish their allegiance to the DB, as argued by the defense. Regardless of the level of temporary resubordination with other Serb forces, the accused are responsible for the crimes of their units and those of the other Serb forces because of their contributions to the JCE. Turning to the Red Berets. The accused contributed to the JCE's common purpose by establishing and directing a special DB unit, initially referred to by others as Frankie's Men and the Kaninjas, then often referred to as the Red Berets. The unit, as it was affectionately called by its members, existed in one form or another from its formation in May 1991, when it was known as a Special Purpose Unit, or JPN, through its formalization as the JATD in August 1993, and on to its reincarnation as the JSO in 1996. As Captain Dragon stated twice in Exhibit P2976, the unit existed at all times. Through the testimony of multiple members of the special units of the DB, through DB payment records and personnel files, and through many other witnesses and documentary materials, the prosecution proved the unit existed at all times and grew over time. In paragraphs 196 to 296 of its final trial brief, the prosecution discusses the activities of the unit from its inception in 1991 through the Kula Award ceremony in 1997, which, in the words of Franco Simatović, recorded on video in Exhibit P61, was a, quote, ceremony marking the anniversary of the formation of the Special Operations Unit of the State Security Service, unquote. The next words out of the accused's mouth were, quote, it was constituted on 4 May 1991, unquote. The training camps and operations discussed in our brief show a repeated pattern of the accused setting up camps to train unit members and other served forces before they were deployed on joint operations where they committed the crimes charged in the indictment. At this stage of the proceedings, it is useful to look at what remains contested and some of the concessions made by the accused in their final trial briefs concerning the Red Berets. Both accused acknowledge in their briefs that the JATD existed after August 1993. Although they still contest their respective roles in some of the JATD's activities, these challenges are not credible in light of the evidence presented at trial. The prosecution will not spend much time at this point discussing the unit's activities between 1993 and 1996, but would note a few specific points. In Section 2 of Stanisić's brief, entitled, quote, debunking the mythology that the DB was a war machine, unquote, Stanišić portrays himself as a simple civil servant who possessed limited operative resources. These submissions ignore the fact that the Serbian DB was devoting funds and resources to their special units through various forms of payment. As examples of cash expenditures on the JATD, the prosecution would refer the trial chamber to row B1 of the confidential evidence chart. The JATD also had priority in terms of staffing. As an example of the preferential treatment in the staffing of the JATD by the accused Stanišić, the prosecution would refer the chamber to row B2 of the confidential evidence chart. And also at this time, for your honors, the prosecution would additionally refer the chamber to page 2 of Slobodan Milosevic's 2001 appeal concerning the Serbian government's expenditures on weapons, ammunition, and equipment for the VRS, RSK, and Special Anti-Terrorist Forces. The appeal is Exhibit P3023. The prosecution requests that the next slide not be broadcast to the public. The personnel files of unit members further illustrate the Red Berets were built and used for combat. All parties in this case tendered personnel files. Here on slide 40 are some references from the personnel files tendered by the defense. Even these files show the commander of the unit was Franco Simatović, and the functions of unit members, described repeatedly as soldiers, included commanding platoons and combat groups. The files tendered by the defense also demonstrate that the unit provided combat training, engaged in combat operations, and sent unit members to the front line. DB payment records, personnel files of unit members, and even the DB's own reports all show the priority of Stanišić was to support a combat unit commanded by Simatović. Your Honors, I don't know if you're anticipating taking a break at this time, or if you'd like me to continue.
I think we take a... Yes. First of all, before even considering to take a break, we should allow the interpreters to finish their interpretation. I think we will take a break after, approximately this time. It's 75 minutes. Would this be a suitable moment?
Yes, Your Honors.
Then we will take the break now and we'll resume at 3 minutes past 4 o'clock.
All rise for your brevet.